Good, good afternoon to everybody. Welcome
Good
to
afternoon.
the class. Before we start with Asayag's presentation, I just would like to bring you in the future, or rather, which is already present, but how the future is being built today. Just to show you, we've been talking of air transport, rail transport. We'll see also maritime transport. We'll see sort of other traditional forms of transport, but I would like you also to consider that transportation is a highly developing technology and system by which new forms of transport are being discovered, or rather are being created and experimented. So the first point I would like to show you is that we know we've talked a lot about air transport, but there are new forms of transport which are very interesting. Let's set aside the issue of interplanetary travels. I mean, going to Mars or going to the moon, which is still sort of in somewhat distant. I mean, the moon you could go, but then apparently nobody wants to go to the moon because there's absolutely nothing to be seen there. But if we look at terrestrial on transport going from one point to another of the Earth, we see that there are several new technologies that are being experimented, and I'll just show you very briefly, just so you have an idea of what we are talking about. So if you just wait a second, I will try to, let's see if I can manage to. Sorry. Can you see the screen?
Yes, it's Elon Musk, no? The idea of Elon Musk.
Well, this is, wait a second, there's not only Elon Musk there.
It's the rocket.
1 second, you'll see. You see 39 minutes. Hong Kong to Singapore, 22 minutes. Okay, now this is suborbital transport. What does suborbital means? It means that it is above the skies. Sorry, 1 second, just let me close this. Let me see if I can remove this. Okay, 1 second. It means that it is above what the normal altitude of airplanes, which is more or less 9,000 meters. Here we're going beyond that altitude, but not completely outside the Earth's orbit. So that is where satellites go. So this is why it's called suborbital. Are we talking of planes or are we talking about satellites? Now, for the moment being, and so obviously this has significant legal and regulatory implications, because if it is, this is considered, what you've seen is considered a sort of aviation. It falls under the control in the US of the Federal Aviation Agency. If instead it is considered something that is not aviation, then it could fall under the control of the National Space Agency, NASA. In the US, suborbital is under the control of NASA. In Europe, the tendency is to say, no, hey, we'll keep this for the moment under the control of the aviation. So there's a legal issue. For the moment, we're just experimenting. We have a whole lot of actors. We have Elon Musk, we have Virgin, that is Richard Branson. We also have Amazon, which is working on this project. So there's many players which are trying to enter this, which seems a promising market. Just to show you that, I mean, you will probably in your lifetime, you will, now you see just originally just the first developments, the first, there are some first travels by experimental travels. The problem is obviously where they take off, because now they're taking off from desertic places and they land in desertic places. And obviously, if you want to use this kind of modes of transport, you want to go from a big town to another big town. You don't want to go from the desert, Arizona desert, to the Gobi Desert. I mean, you're traveling for mostly business for the moment. The estimated cost is around $200,000 to $300,000 per trip, so it is pretty expensive. But one can imagine that this will, on the economies of scale, this will diminish. But just to show that what we are looking at now, we think that, you know, airplanes are the fastest way of communication, and we have a very regulated environment. Tomorrow, we might have a much more advanced context in which we have something which is not clear if it is aviation or space travel. It depends very much on the choice on what the different states do and what they prefer, what kind of regulatory environment they prefer. Just to point out this, just to show you the difference of approach, in the US, gradually the whole space exploration and including also suborbital flights is somehow privatized, in the sense that NASA is saying, well, listen, I will favor private investments in this activity. And so if you go to Mars and you reach Mars, and what you find is yours. So it is a typical American frontier approach. In the early 19th century, the government of the US that didn't control the Western territories said, listen, you go there, if you occupy the land is yours, the so-called Homestead Act. So, I mean, this is, as you see, this is a very rich history in American page in American legal history. And so we can imagine that Americans will replicate this model when it comes to, they are replicating this model when it comes to space exploration. The same thing is in the suborbital travel. So going from one point to another point of the Earth in nothing, in half an hour, but maybe even if it isn't 1 hour. I mean, if you want to fly from London to Sydney, Australia, it's a 14-hour flight. Imagine doing this in 1 hour. So just to point out, it is sort of the changes are extremely significant in the aspects of travel, with a huge amount of issues which are technological, but also obviously legal, of international agreement, because here, are we flying? I mean, now if I send up a satellite up in the sky, well, there's no issue of Chicago Convention. We don't apply the Chicago Convention. So you can't challenge the fact that there is a satellite that is crossing the sky, and you see them at night. You see these moving objects in the sky, which are not planes. Obviously, they're not stars, but they are satellites. Because you can see them that they're lighted by the light of the sun, and so they're luminous. And so you don't apply the Chicago Convention. Obviously, if they're spying on you, obviously states can react, and superpowers react very simply. They just do some kind of create some kind of intervention which prevents that satellite from spying on the specific territory. So just to point out that it is there's a great deal of movement going on using this suborbital space, which is why you see showed 27,000 kilometers per hour, because to the absence of gravity, I mean this object, this flying object, can go very, very fast, while in the sky, obviously it meets the sort of the opposition of the atmosphere, and therefore it is slowed down. It isn't that the plane is going against the winds, against anyhow. The sky is composed of objects, so it is so the plane doesn't fly in a vacuum. So just to show you that why these suborbital flights are so much considered, instead of making an even faster plane, a supersonic plane, let's imagine that we're going above the atmosphere and in the subsonic, sorry, not subsonic, in this area in which there's less opposition by the context and by the atmosphere, and therefore it is they can go much faster. Now, this is not the only example. I'll just show you another example, which I mentioned yesterday, because last week, or maybe on Monday, there was this first experimental, sorry, just 1 second, let me open the
bring in Jay Walder. He's the CEO of Virgin Hyperloop. And Jay, congratulations on this milestone. Let's just start with how big of a step forward this is just to commercializing the Hyperloop technology.
Having me, and it's all smiles. I'll tell you, this is huge. This is huge, and we've really, you know, if you think about Hyperloop, we had already proven that the technology works. We'd run about 400 tests, and the question that we got asked most often is it safe? And yesterday we answered that question with a resounding yes. We had the first passengers in a Hyperloop pod. They were two of our team members, our co-founder and CTO, Josh Geigel, and our director of passenger experience, Sarah Lucian. And they got in and they had an unbelievably great ride, and we're all smiles.
It's definitely very cool, but historians will point out that the first subway system in New York was a pneumatic kind of system. Now, this is clearly light years ahead, but when do you get to 600 miles per hour? Because those of us who are, you know, sci-fi geeks want to go that fast. And do you have the financing to build a track long enough to test at 600 miles per hour?
So let's take it in pieces to what's going on here, right? So first off, let's be clear. This is paving the way not to what people did in literally not even the 20th century, but the 19th century. This is really setting out and saying, what are we building with a clean sheet of paper for the 21st century? It's high speed, as you said, over 600 miles an hour. It's high capacity. It's on demand and flexible, more like ride hailing than the way that you think about train schedules. It carries people and freight, so it gives us both mobility and logistics at the same time. And it's green. This is going to work without polluting the air that we breathe. So this has absolutely nothing to do with what was done in the 19th century. This is about using modern technology, automated equipment, magnetic levitation, machine intelligence, and being able to do it. It's real, and we're proving that that's happening. The facility that we have here in Las Vegas, I'm about 20 miles outside of Las Vegas as I'm speaking to you right now. The facility we have out here has a 500-meter track, and that's what we used for the test yesterday. We have announced that we are building the U.S. Hyperloop Certification Center. Will be in West Virginia. And that facility will be about 10 kilometers, about 6 miles long. So 20 times the length of what we have here will allow us to get up to higher speeds, will allow us to be able to demonstrate multiple pods in the tube at the same time, and to go through the full process of safety certification. We should have that certification done by 2025, and we're looking to have the first routes running before the end of this decade. So this is not just moving forward, it is really moving forward at what I'll call Hyperloop speed.
Jay, and then when you do reach that goal, or maybe ahead of that goal, at the end of the day, what's so important is you have to convince people to ride it. How are you going to convince people to give it a chance that it is in fact safe? Because someone like me, I mean, I would be a little bit hesitant to get on board.
Look, I think that's a process that really starts with today, right? I mean, the people that you saw ride Hyperloop yesterday are two ordinary people, and we're going to put more ordinary people in Hyperloop. And I think you build up people's confidence by doing that. We go through rigorous safety processes and procedures. We're using really the most modern safety equipment and ways of being able to do this. And I think we can show everybody, and we will ultimately go through a process of certification that doesn't just involve our company, but will involve government as well. We're having certification regulation discussions in the United States with the Department of Transportation. They're absolutely thrilled about what we're doing. In Europe as well, with the European Union, as well as in India, in the Gulf countries. So I think we're going to see something that is really going to take off very, very quickly.
Hey, Jay, for the record, I'd ride. I'm not afraid. I'd do it.
Good. Me too.
Adam and you are both more of a daredevil, I guess, than I am. But it was a good pitch. I think you convinced me. I think I'd be more willing to take the chance now. But Jay Walder, we wish we had more time. CEO of Virgin Hyperloop, congratulations again on that successful test over the weekend. We wish you all the best and hope to have you soon.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Okay, now just let me move out of this. 1 second. Okay, this I can move. Okay, so this is Hyperloop. Virgin and also obviously Elon Musk, who's working on Hyperloop. How does it work? It works on a vacuum. There's this huge tube. You've seen this tube, which is in a vacuum, and the whatever it is, the carriage is moved through magnetic force ahead, going from origin to destination, and through a magnetic force. The test is very, very small test. It says 500 meters. So come on, it's very little. I mean, they present this as a very a great feat, but if you look at the actual speed they went slightly more than 100 kilometers per hour, which is not really much. Obviously, in 500 meters, you can't reach great speeds. So we'll have to see how this works on larger distances. And then, well, it says, well, this is environmentally friendly. Well, but if you have these huge infrastructure that has to go from one point to another, and it has to go straight, it isn't sort of when you are going at 600, more or less something like 800, 900 kilometers per hour. Well, it isn't, you can do sharp bends. There's nothing like sharp bends. So you will have, there will be lots of environmental and urban planning issues. But just to show you where we are moving to in the field of transport. And I'll just set aside the issues of other self-motion, self-driving objects. We've all seen how Tesla has been putting on the market self-driving automobiles, which are for the moment, the results do not seem to be very encouraging, but I mean, Tesla is going ahead and is having great profits on the stock market. So people believe that this will become the future. But we also already see this widely used in local transport, growingly in many towns. Underground transport is completely driverless. There's no driving. Everything is controlled from outside. So just to show you, I mean, when we find that you've probably met this, if you've gone to a rather modern airport, you find a shuttle between a terminal and another, which there's no driver there. And you can apply this obviously to a complex underground system. This is already developed quite well in the Persian Gulf countries, which have a lot of money that they can spend there. But it is not only limited to terrestrial movement, that is automobiles and underground transport. We are seeing this increasingly in the area of maritime transport. The issue is this: you have a container ship that has to go from China to Europe. Do you really need a crew there? Can't you somehow manage this on sort of through satellites, through indirect controlling the ship by remote? And this is what increasingly now they're using this on transatlantic routes. So what does this mean? So very simply that when the ship arrives near the coast, well, the pilot is sent on board, the ship is stopped, the pilot gets there, climbs up, goes on board, and then the pilot obviously will drive the ship into the port. So just to point out, this of development of transport is, and of these technologies, is becoming more and more important. And obviously behind this technology, we find all kinds of legal issues, obviously technical standards which must be approved, safety that must be approved, obviously we want to protect passengers and so on. So this and environmental issues. So lawyers will always have to do, where there's transport, you will find legal issues. So we don't know if the suborbital flights will come into place before Hyperloop or before massive driverless cars or driverless lorries or driverless public transport, but there'll always be some kind of problems for lawyers which lawyers will have to solve. Just to show you that sort of we have to look at the past, because past is very important. It guides us into, it makes us understand what are the issues, but we can expect that those issues which we are examining today in our class will represent themselves, although in a different context, in the future modes of transport, which you will, I expect, experiment. Having said this, we'll leave the floor to Asayag for his presentation. Okay.
All right. So this case is about the European Commission decision of the 7 August 2003. And it relates to a proceeding pursuant to Article 82 of the EC Treaty. This case was initiated by a complaint from the German railway undertaking GVG.
Sorry, yeah, 82 now is 102, so dominant position, abuse of dominant position. Just okay. Article 82 at that time in 2003 is what now is Article 102 of the Lisbon Treaty. Just to make it clear, just so we don't get confused about the numbers. I mean, okay, sorry. We're interested of the context. The numbers change, but the text is exactly the same.
Yes. So this is a complaint from the German railway undertaking GVG against Ferrovie dello Stato SPA, FS, and it's the Italian national railway carrier. So that's it. The parties are GVG for George Verco Organization GmbH, I will call it just GVG. And it's a German railway undertaking operating international rail passenger services on the basis of national authorization since March 1992. And since 1995, it is able to operate passengers rail transport services. And since 2000, it provides a service between Sweden and Prague and Sweden and Berlin.
Switzerland, not Sweden. Sweden
not
is
Sweden.
Switzerland. Switzerland.
Switzerland, yes.
Right, somehow, sorry, Asayag, honestly. Well, anyhow, the issue is Germany, the corridor from Germany to Italy. If you want to go from Germany to Italy, you must pass by Switzerland.
It's Bales. That's it. The city is Bales,
Basel.
Yes.
Basel in German or in English, and Bâle in French.
Bâle, okay.
Basilea in Italian.
Okay. So
sorry, Asayag, I'm just sort of, but if you want to do transport, you must also have a little bit of knowledge of geography. Otherwise, you don't, you tend to mix up countries and towns. Go ahead.
Okay, so it's Switzerland and Berlin. So the other party is FS, the major Italian railway operator and a state-owned enterprise. and it is a public limited company under the supervision of the Ministry of the Treasury. So what were the facts in this case? It was that the GVG complained that since 1995, FS had been refusing to provide access to the Italian infrastructure to enter into negotiation for the formation of an international grouping and to provide traction. So all of this prevented the GVG from providing an international rail passenger services from various points in Germany via Bâle to Milan. So the Commission has the conclusion that the FS abused its dominant position with the meaning of Article 102 of the EC Treaty and Article 8 of Regulation EEC number 1017/68. And following the initiation of the Commission's investigation, FS has given undertakings to the Commission that the abuse will be terminated and will not be repeated. So Article 102, I made a mistake. So the EC Treaty, any abuse by one or more undertakings of a dominant position within the common market or in substantial part of it shall be prohibited as incompatible with the common market insofar as it may affect trade between member states. So that's the fact, but what is the decision about? It's just about an international rail passenger transport service between Germany and Milan. So GVG wishes to cater in particular for business customers by offering a Bâle-Milan connection, and the attractiveness of such a service depends considerably on the time schedule and the train path envisaged by GVG, because it would allow its trains to depart with a time difference of about 2 hours as usual. But what were the requirements to establish a service in general, railway services? So in order to provide a cross-border rail transport service, railway undertakings first need a license. Then you need an international grouping. It is an association of at least 2 railway undertakings established in different member states for the purpose of providing international transport services between the states. And it must be granted access and transit member rights in the member states of their constituent railway undertakings, as well as transit rights in other member states. And you also need access to infrastructure, means a certain time slot on the tracks of the railway networks on which you wish to provide the cross-border service. The company also need an access to international train paths, and the provision of international rail transport services requires the coordination of train paths on the national railway networks. You also need a safety certificate, of course, to ensure the safe service on the route concerned. And to obtain it, the undertaking must comply with the relevant regulations under national law. And finally, the railway undertaking means traction. It's simply a locomotive and a driver to move the train across the network. So a bit of background to this case. And it starts because nothing in the Italian legislation before or since the transposition of the relevant community legislation prevented the FS from granting access to the railway infrastructure or from setting up an international grouping with or providing traction services to a railway undertaking established in another member state. And on the contrary, several provisions of Italian law imply that FS should be proactive in the provision of access to the infrastructure. So on the 17th January 1992, GVG started the action and wrote to FS to request information on the cost of access to the Italian rail network in idea with the mind of providing a passenger transport service infrastructure, transport service, infrastructure access cost, and traction cost. And FS never clearly replied. And since 1995, September, FS knew of GVG the intention to provide an international passenger service to Milan, and that at least since August 1999, it was informed of GVG's request to enter into an international grouping with FS. And GVG repeated this request in writing to FS in its complaint to the Commission and all of the FTE meetings. So that's the meeting where all the railway company discuss about what they want to change or anything. And furthermore, FS has been aware of, at least since December 1998, that GVG wanted it to provide traction for this service. And on 25 October 1999, GVG lodged its complaints against the FS, arguing that the latter had abused its dominant position by refusing to grant GVG access to the Italian railway market. And on the 22 June on 2001, the Commission sent a statement of objection to FS. And at this preliminary stage, the Commission had come to the conclusion that the FS has abused its dominant position by refusing to provide information to GVG and refusing to provide traction. And finally, FS had abused its dominant position by refusing to enter into an international grouping with GVG. And by doing so, FS had eliminated all competition on the downstream market of passenger transport by rail. So they were the only furnisher of railway transport. So following FS reply to the statement of objection on the 30 October 2001, a hearing took place where both parties could expose their point of view. And as a result, the Commission undertook further fact-finding in order to verify the assertions made by both parties during the hearing. And on the 6th December 2002, FS
shouldn't you change the slide?
No. It's detailed. It's not very detailed. FS offered two commitments attached to the decision, and that's it. So to take this decision, the Commission identified different relevant markets, considering the abuse of the dominant position of the FS. There were three markets for access to the infrastructure, the traction market, and the international rail passenger transport market. But before everything, the Commission assessed how was the dominance of the FS in this case, and whether FS could be held liable or no. So because on 13 July 2001, FS accomplished a restructuring process to become a holding company. And within the holding company, as legally independent subsidiaries, FS Trenitalia was responsible for transport services, rolling stock and traction, and FS RFI was responsible for the operation of the infrastructure. But however, FS is well an undertaking because within the meaning of Article 102, because it provides rail transport services on a commercial basis. And furthermore, FS had been assigned certain regulatory functions in its role of the infrastructure manager and allocation body. And due to his role, FS RFI acts as the supplier of infrastructure capacity on the market for access to the infrastructure. And this is a commercial activity. So FS can be held liable for the behavior of its subsidiaries FS RFI and FS Trenitalia also after the restructuring. So it doesn't change anything. FS can be held liable in the end. Then the Commission assessed how was the dominance on the FS on the relevant upstream markets. So FS had a statutory monopoly to operate the Italian railway infrastructure and was also responsible for establishing and maintaining the Italian railway infrastructure and also assigning train pass to railway operators in Italy, and all of this in return for a fee. So FS is clearly dominant on the entire Italian intercity railway infrastructure. Then the Commission assessed if whether or not the FS had a dominance on the traction market. And to sum up briefly this part, until April 2001, FS had a de jure monopoly for the provision of traction on the Italian rail infrastructure. And since then, FS had de facto monopoly for the provision of traction from passenger services on the route concerned. And moreover, at the present stage, in the liberalization of the EU railway sector, GVG cannot provide traction by itself on this route. And FS is actually the only source for traction on the concerned route. And it can therefore be concluded that FS is dominant on the relevant traction market, and that in order to operate its plane service, it is indispensable for GVG to obtain traction from FS. So FS had a dominant position. Then the Commission assessed whether or not there was a dominance on the market for rail passenger transport from the FS railway. And it's clearly obvious because FS was dominant on the market for rail passenger transport on the routes that belongs to the relevant market, as we defined above. So far, only FS had obtained a safety certificate to operate passenger railway transport services between the market, on the market. And FS is therefore the only Italian railway undertaking that can enter into an international grouping with GVG for the particular service that the GVG wants to provide. So transport from Bell to Milan. And finally, the Commission assessed whether or not there was a domination on the market in a substantial part of the common market. So when a member state has granted a statutory monopoly to an undertaking on a certain part of its territory, this territory constitutes a substantial part of the common market. So the market for access to the Italian infrastructure can be considered to be a substantial part of the common market. So after that, the Commission assessed looked for in which situation there was an abuse from the FS. So indeed, FS had committed, it's obvious now that the committed several abuses of its dominant position in the relevant upstream market and downstream markets, which had effect on competition in international rail passenger transport on the number of routes from German city to Milan and passing by Bâle. So there were abuse on the relevant upstream markets. And first, it was when FS refused to grant access to the Italian railway infrastructure, because FS held the monopoly as the allocation body that had been designated by the Italian state to decide upon requests for infrastructure capacity on the Italian railway network. And in this capacity, FS is so responsible for assigning train passes to railway operators in Italy. And the railway infrastructure can be considered as an essential facility. You can't come with your money and build a new one. So it constitutes an abuse of dominant position because it excludes a potential competitor from the market. Then there was also an abuse when the FS refused to provide attraction to GVG, because FS had refused to provide attraction to GVG, and its refusal was clearly unjustified because all the security requirements were met by the GVG. So FS had FS had refused action to a potential competitor in a neighboring market to the market for traction. And as we said, FS was dominant on the market, but also on the downstream market for all rail passenger transport. And by refusing to provide traction for GVG, FS is preventing a potential competitor from entering the market. So it's clearly in opposition with the Article 102 of the EC Treaty, because it's preserving its monopoly position and it's on the separate downstream market by eliminating potential competition on that market. And the court has also constantly held that the extensions of a monopoly in a given market to a neighboring market without objective justification was prohibited as it is written in Article 102 of the EC Treaty. And FS refusal to provide traction was not justified by any objective reason, and it just protects its own monopoly. So it therefore constitutes an abuse of a dominant position. Then there was also an abuse there was also an abuse from the FS on the market in rail passenger transport. And indeed, FS refused to negotiate the formation of the international grouping without any justification. So it constitutes an abuse of dominant position. And while FS has pointed out that in general that there is no obligation under EU law to form an international grouping, and that it would enter into an international grouping only if it had a commercial interest, so if there was benefit for him to do it. It has not, FS has not provided concrete reasons why it could not enter into such negotiations. And instead, FS has argued that its refusal to enter into negotiation with GVG was justified since GVG planned service would compete with services already provided by FS, and also especially on the Bâle-Milan route. And so the FS has only refused to give the market in rail passenger transport to once again keep its monopoly on this route. So since we've seen that abuse have been clearly made, we can ask ourselves how this has affected the trade between member states, as the last part of the Article 102 states. Because indeed in the GVG aim to provide an international transport service between Germany and Italy. And as pointed out, it feeds customers from Germany to Sweden, Switzerland, and then provide a rail passenger transport service to Milan. And in view of the characteristic of these routes and the heavy transport traffic, and given that this affects transport service between two member states of the EU, the abuse just described above significantly affect trade between member states, because two member states can't, it affects trade between two member states. So FS is not relying on there is no justification, because FS is not relying on the derogation provided by Article 102, the four letters ABC, which give a justification to derogate to Article 102. So what was the reasoning of the courts? By refusing to enter into an international grouping with GVG for the purpose of providing an international railway passenger service between Germany and Italy on the concerned route, FS has abused its dominant position on the Italian market for passenger railway transport and indeed in doing so is in breach of Article 102 of the EC Treaty. By refusing to deal effectively with GVG's request for access to the railway network on the concerned route for travel of passengers purpose, FS has abused its dominant position on the market for access to the infrastructure, preventing GVG from entering the market in international rail passenger transport in breach of Article 102 of the treaty. And last, by refusing to provide traction to GVG in the form of a locomotive and a driver, the FS company has abused its dominant position once again on the traction market, preventing GVG from entering the market in international rail passenger transport, and it's still a breach of Article 102 of the EC Treaty. So, what measure? So the decision of the court was that the court ordered the termination of the infringement, and as a result, FS Trenitalia has entered into an international grouping agreement and has agreed on the terms of traction contracts with GVG. And the FS has also undertaken to provide GVG with suitable train paths on the concerned segment. And as soon as corresponding train paths are made available by the Swiss network for the Bale concern segment. However, in this case, the commission didn't put any fine on the FS company, so it's quite unusual. Knowing that the case had the refusal of the FS had prevent GVG from entering on the market for, I think, 12 years. So it's a big loss of potential profit. But the court justified this decision because of the novelty of the case, as GVG had been the first and only new entrant railway undertaking to approach FS with a view to form an international grouping. And furthermore, FS had proposed undertakings which ensure that FS would not repeat the abuses in the future, and which should contribute significantly to the dismantling of untried barriers that were the problem in this case. So to conclude briefly, the FS holding company can be considered as responsible as a single undertaking, and the decision is therefore addressed to the FS holding company. So the commission adopted by decision that FS shall immediately bring to an end the infringement referred above, and all I talk about of the decision, and shall in the future refrain from repeating any similar act of conduct. That's it.
Okay, thanks, Asayag. Just one point I want to make. You in this slide, you show the court's decision. This hasn't got to do with the court. It is a decision by the commission. Just to
this one?
It is a decision by the commission. It is not a decision. It is an administrative decision. It is not a judicial decision. It is the commission.
The fact.
No, it's not. It's not the court's reason anyhow, because yeah, it is not. No, it is the commission that ordered. But when you point out that the court's decision on the slides, you indicate that the court it is not a judicial decision. What happens? A party feels that it is being is suffering damage because of an agreement which is contrary to Article 101, or by an abuse of dominant position according to 102. It sends a complaint to the commission, and the commission investigates on this complaint. It hears the parties and then takes a decision. Then, after the decision is taken, then the case, the parties can take the appeal this decision in front of the court. We've seen these several times. For example, from the first case we analyzed, the case of the Portuguese case, we saw that there was a decision taken by the Commission. Portugal did not abide by that decision, and therefore the Commission brought the case in front of the court. Or vice versa, there is a decision by the Commission in the Ryanair case, which you analyzed. The Commission took a certain decision, and Ryanair and the Charleroi Airport brought an appeal in front of the Court of First Instance. Just to remind you on how the system works. Now, just one point I wanted to make. You mentioned the issue of traction. Why was GVG asking for traction? Can you explain again what we mean by traction and why it was asking Ferrovie dello Stato to provide traction?
Traction is the locomotive, so the wagon that can
engine
drive the train, and also a driver which is competent on the concerned routes, and I think that's the problem now. They wanted a competent driver now, which know the routes from Germany to Italy, and they didn't have a traction available. Because yes, this part, I don't really understand why the Commission insisted so much on this part of attraction. It's a big part of the case.
Because at that time, according to the regulations, existing regulations, traction, according also to safety standards, engines coming from a different country could not, and drivers coming from a different country could not travel on the infrastructure of another country. So if you had a German engine with a German driver, this German engine with a German driver could not go on the Italian infrastructure. Why? For two reasons. A, because of technical reasons. The fact that if you have a German train, it's not said that it can operate on an Italian railway infrastructure. Just think of the electricity. You have a difference in tension of the kind of electricity which is used for the German engine as compared with the kind of electricity that is used for the Italian engine. It seems to us, it seems so obvious. It is not obvious in the complex machines such as train engines. The electrical apparatus is very significant. Second point, to drive a train from one country to another, well, you need a certain license. And if you do not have a license, and at that time in the 90s, you did not have a license, you could not drive a train from Germany to Italy. It's just like as if you had a driving license, you have a French driving license, but you may not use that driving license in a different country from France. So the same thing in a much more complex system was at that time was that of saying, if you have a German driver's license, you can drive a train only in Germany. You may not drive it in another country. If you remember what we saw yesterday concerning the European Railway Agency, the European Railway Agency issues a pan-European license, which means that if engines and drivers have a license to circulate also on different infrastructures. But this is 2016. At that time, 20 years ago, it was only at the moment that trains could move only from very limited, they could not move to other countries. So this is the first point that I think it's important to make. The second question I just wanted to ask you, what is this issue of grouping? You've mentioned it several times. What is this issue of grouping? Why is it so important in the decision of the Commission?
Because you need to have in order to have interstate railway, you need at least 2 states. So they need to agree on which conditions the transport will be made. So I don't remember the name of the yearly convention, QTE, something like this. QTE, the convention where all the railway company meet to discuss about this, and that's where you can eventually have an international grouping allowing you to do interstate travel with your train.
The point is this, Asayag and the class. At that time, we're talking of the 90s, just keep in mind that all railways were substantially under state monopoly, and only very, very slowly we were opening up the market for freight transport. Yeah, instead we're not talking of freight, we're talking of passenger transport. And so the idea was that if you wanted to favor transnational transport, substantially you had to get a company in one country, a company in another country, which would have worked together. This is for the fact of groups. The point is that the only company that was available, and you pointed out in one of your slides, the only company that in Italy had a license to operate passenger services was Ferrovie dello Stato. So GBG, even if it wanted to make a grouping with another company, couldn't do it with anybody but with Ferrovie dello Stato. So this is why Ferrovie dello Stato is in a dominant position. So what is this? The refusal to contract. If you look at paragraph 1 of Article 102, you see that one of the typical cases of violation of abuse of dominant position is when a party in a dominant position refuses to contract with another party. So if the market had been liberalized, if there were many companies which had a license that held the license for passenger services, well, Ferrovie dello Stato could have said, no, I don't want to do a contract with you. You do a grouping with someone else. You find someone else. So it could have done that. But in this case, when the Ferrovie dello Stato is the only company which holds a passenger license, it has an obligation to contract with GBG. So this is the important aspect. So just keep in mind for transport, but also for any other field, that companies that are in a dominant position are under special obligations, including that of concluding contracts on a non-discriminatory basis. So this is one of the reasons why the Commission told Ferrovie dello Stato to stop immediately, and it was very generous. It said, well, for the moment it's the first case, but hopefully this case will somehow be useful for also other countries if they are asked to create an international grouping, so they know what is expecting them if they do not enter in an international grouping with a third country, with a company which wants to enter that market. Okay, Asayag. you can, we can remove the thing, and now we can just let me go on 1 second. Let's go back to, sorry. Here we go. Okay. Can you see the slides?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm just trying to see 1 second here. Why? Sorry, 1 second. Just let me. I'll get back here 1 second. I want to try to see why this is. Okay, now I'll go back to. Okay, now, what is the, we were talking of yesterday, we were talking of unbundling, and that is the separation of the infrastructure manager from the services which are provided on the infrastructure, typically freight and passenger services, but also a whole lot of other services which are somehow related, marshalling, cleaning, maintenance, management of stations. Just to point out that separation, this is the level of separation. So why do we feel that separation is essential? Because the fundamental issue is that the infrastructure manager is impartial when it comes to allocating capacity and charging for infrastructure use. Capacity means what trains can travel, sort of how the size of how many carriages can go. For example, establishing that not more than 6 carriages, passenger carriages, or 40 trucks, freight trucks. So then again, the element essential is the party which regulates infrastructure use is in possession of all information, including sensitive commercial information about the users. So it is, on the one hand, we see that if you do not have this information, the third party that wants to enter the infrastructure cannot enter the infrastructure. We've seen in the GBG, it starts asking for information in 1992. It receives 1991, 1992. It receives access only 12 years later. So, I mean, but if you don't have this technical information, you can't access the infrastructure. Secondly, what happens? Why should the infrastructure manager be impartial? Because the infrastructure manager receives sensitive information from a competitor, and therefore might use this information to tell to its partner company, its subsidiary, saying, hey, listen, they're going to do this kind of service. Well, you better wake up. Why don't you do this too? So if the infrastructure manager is part of a group that is managed in a unified fashion and includes one or more railway undertakings, this group has de facto competitive advantage over competing railway undertakings. Unless it takes appropriate measures, there's a high risk of collusion. Just think of Ferrovie dello Stato, which is the holding. It has 2 subsidiaries, Rete Ferroviaria Italiana, which is the which controls infrastructure, and another subsidiary, which is Trenitalia, which provides passenger service. If you ask the infrastructure manager, you say, I want to do this, I need infrastructure for these purposes, obviously the infrastructure manager could pass this kind of information to Trenitalia, this sensitive information, and so the main competitor knows in advance what are the commercial projects plans of its competitor. So you see, this is absolutely. unacceptable from, if we look this from a competition aspect. And it would be a temptation for this group to manage the infrastructure according to its own interests, for example, by not making it interoperable for neighboring railway undertakings, or by developing the network according to its own needs rather than those of competing railway undertakings. So just to point out why we want the railway infrastructure manager to be independent and impartial. Clearly, if there's competition, if there's any foul play by the infrastructure manager, obviously the competitor will challenge this. So you see the independence of the infrastructure management functions. So what do we have? Free models. Or we have a legally organizationally and institutionally independent rail infrastructure manager. Or we have an integrated rail infrastructure manager working alongside an independent capacity allocation and charging body. This option may include the variant of a fully independent infrastructure manager, which delegates particular tasks to the incumbent railway undertaking, and a legally and organizationally independent infrastructure manager, which is part of a railway holding structure or any structure controlled by railway undertaking. So we see how complex it is to reach this unbundling. So until now, we do not have, in most countries, at least in countries which are experimenting liberalization, apart from the UK, where the only company that provides the infrastructure is British Rail, and the franchise holders are not related to British Rail. That is the only case in which there's a very clear separation between the infrastructure manager and the service providers, the railway service providers. In other countries, Germany, Italy, and Spain, Austria, Italy, and Spain, not France, because France has been no liberalization until now. The infrastructure manager still belongs to a group which manages also services on the infrastructure. So there is the possibility of a conflict of interest. So what are the ways to bring unbundling? Ownership separation. The infrastructure manager and the railway operator are autonomous entities with separate ownership, balance sheets, and staff. You see UK, Spain, Finland, Denmark, Netherlands, and Portugal. Organizational separation. Separate business units are created with a large degree of operational freedom, either operating as part of the railway operator or organized within a holding company framework. And this is the case of Italy and Germany. And the third hybrid model of separation is called operational separation. The infrastructure manager is responsible of some specific activities, typically capacity allocation and charging, but daily administration is devolved to the major undertaking. And that is the case of France, where there's really minimum unbundling. Yeah, well, you will see the slides. You'll have pros and cons of structural separation. Now, just to, well, we've already seen this a little bit, UK, the various models which we find in various countries, of the kind of how we've operated liberalization. So what are the advantages of vertical separation in the rail sector? Vertical means that you're separating the infrastructure manager from the railway services company. First of all, transparency. So there's transparency of the capacity and terms and conditions of the infrastructure manager. So the infrastructure manager is someone who holds the infrastructure and says, listen, the more you use this infrastructure, the more I make profit. So I have, I'm not interested in, it's just think of someone who holds the motorway. The motorway, the company that is managing a motorway has no specific interest on who is traveling on the motorway. It is trying to do its best to increase traffic on the motorway. So it presents what are the conditions for traveling on the motorway, and the more circulation there is on the motorway, the more profit it makes. So you see, in looking at another transport sector, think of motorways, just think of the motorway manager and those who take the motorway. It can be a private individual who's going for holiday with his car. It might be someone who's traveling for business. It might be a truck, a lorry. It might be some other kind of business that is using the motorway to transport goods from one part or another of the network. In that case, you see, it's very clear. There's transparency. You are interested in making known what are the conditions for which you are offering your infrastructure. Cost efficiency, separation allows specialization on core activities and better customization of goods and services offered. If you're concentrated on the infrastructure, you want to make this infrastructure very efficient. The more efficient it is, the better it works, the more traffic you will have on that infrastructure. You will make investments because you know that if you make investments, you will attract more traffic on your infrastructure. So this brings cost efficiency because you specialize in that field and you do not have divergent interests. The interest of the infrastructure manager is not necessarily the same as the interest of the railway transport service operator. Typically, the infrastructure manager wants to make as much money it can from those who use it. The railway services company wants to spend the least possible for using the infrastructure. So they're conflicting interests. And then neutrality is that a non-discriminatory third-party access to networks can be only realized when there is a true separation between the companies operating on the network and those responsible for charging for access to the network infrastructure. Because we've seen that there can be conflicts of interest between those who are managing the infrastructure and those who are using the infrastructure if they belong to the same group. Competition, clear and separate responsibilities of infrastructure managers are essential, and transport operators are essential to increase the level of competition. Competitive pressure ensure that railway operators take the necessary rationalization measures and bring about innovation and development in this sector. So clearly, you cannot, if you are a railway operator which belongs to a certain holding, you say, well, anyhow, I'm protected by the owner of the infrastructure. I don't have to do much investment. I'm not so much interested in this. Then reliability, that means that obviously the decisions, there's no second thoughts about and no idea that the decisions taken by the infrastructure manager are biased in favor of the parent company. And this means privatization of commercial activities. Ownership unbundling separates networks and commercial activities, paving the way for privatization of commercial parts of the industry. Or very simply, if you are a profitable infrastructure manager, we've seen this with airports and the this is a typical idea that the Commission has, having seen what happened with airports. If you have a profitable airport and you are a state-owned company, you might decide, listen, I'm not going to privatize this this airport, but I'm going to put it into the form of a shareholder company, and therefore I'm going to sell shares on the stock market. So I bring in money from investors who want to, private investors who want to put money in the airport because they know that airports are a profitable business, and therefore they're bringing, so it isn't the state that is putting money in the airport, but they're private investors that are willing to put money in the airport because they know they will receive a dividend. So you see that there is also this advantage. If the infrastructure manager becomes profitable, well, then you don't necessarily have to privatize it, but you could sell shares on the stock market. However, there are disadvantages of this vertical separation, because first of all, we have transitional cost. We've seen that historically, all these railway companies are state-owned, and they manage both infrastructure and services, and so you must change in the existing industry structure involves cost of restructuring the companies, renegotiation the existing contracts, introducing changes in personnel and housing. So clearly, this is one element. Second, loss of the economies of scope. What is an economy of scope? Separation of infrastructure and operation leads to the loss of advantages which arise from the integrated performance of different activities within one railway company. Vertical integration, which we find many examples of vertical integration. Just think of a television company, a broadcasting company that owns not only the studios and that does the production, but also owns the whole network, the antennas to broadcast its message. This is a typical vertical integration. Well, it has certain advantages which are economies of scope. You're just thinking that, well, it's important that I control also the means through which I broadcast my programs, and I'm not dependent on someone else. So just to point out, this can be also economies of scope. And increased risk of insufficient investment in the infrastructure. We know that the infrastructure needs lots and lots of money, and the money comes mostly from the use of the infrastructure. So if the infrastructure is not sufficiently profitable, well, or if the profits remain in the company which has provided the services. So let's imagine Rete Ferroviaria Italiana is separate from Trenitalia. That is, the Trenitalia makes lots of money because lots of passengers travel on Trenitalia, but Trenitalia puts only part of that profit to Rete Ferroviaria Italiana for the charges, for the use of the infrastructure. This means that there is less profit for the infrastructure manager and therefore less investment in the infrastructure. And then what is called double marginalization. It is, you have to pay twice the same costs. So when you separate two companies, obviously these companies have to have a certain cost and twice. Typically, if I am the railway operator, I'm operating a passenger service, and I have to pay a charge to the infrastructure manager, I have to pay value-added tax on that. So this, if they were not separated, if they were same unit, they would not pay, they would just pay, there would be no payment the monies would simply pass from one pocket to another without any value-added tax on it. If you consider the value-added tax can be very high, let's imagine 20%, if not more, you can see that this is a loss of a revenue. And then there may be some coordination problems when the two companies are separate. Let's try to just to sum up the issues concerning unbundling. This is a document by the Organization of Economic Cooperation, Cooperation of and Economic Development. It's a document of 2006, so we are still at starting point in the liberalization of transport in, at least in Europe. The railway sector is an area where trade-offs between structural separation and vertical integration are quite difficult to disentangle. So there are advantages and disadvantages. So vertical separation makes regulation much more complex and requires new mechanisms for resolving conflicts in train pass allocation decisions, for enforcing standards at wheel-rail interface, and for determining who is to blame for delays. Yes, this is a concern, but we see that on the whole, regulation, pass allocation, substantially now we can use very intelligent, smart systems of pass allocation. And if it is regulated by some kind of program which is set, well, we can probably solve many of the issues. Yes, surely who is to blame for delays, but I don't think this is a great, very much issue for we shall see it when we're looking at passenger protection. If the delay is due to the infrastructure manager, the railway company will ask damages to the railway infrastructure. It will have to reimburse passengers, but will and then will act against the infrastructure manager. So it's just passing off the damage. In addition, the regulator must ensure the provision of efficient level of quality, including safety of the track infrastructure, and efficient and timely investment in upgrades to the track infrastructure. And then the higher cost of regulation on the vertical separation needs to be balanced with the positive effect on competition that vertical separation may produce. And the major regulatory problem, it may be difficult for the rail infrastructure to cover its cost if the access charges are calculated without reference to the final demand. So the problem is this. When you have an infrastructure, especially let's imagine a new infrastructure, you build a high-speed train path from point of origin to point of destination, which has an enormous cost of billions of euros. How are you going to recover this sum? And this is a very complex issue on how you're going to recover this sum, and the effects that this the need to recover these sums will have on the cost of passenger tickets. A very good example of this very complex issue is done by the Channel Tunnel joint venture initiative, which is a French-British initiative, which they spent billions and billions of euros to build the Channel Tunnel, which is there, but they reasoned on the idea that they would have to recover these billions invested in a very short time. This had significant effects on the cost of traveling in the Channel Tunnel, and therefore this has reduced the use of the Channel Tunnel. So just to point out that if you think that you can recover these infrastructure costs on a short term meaning 20, 30 years, well, probably it is not sufficient. So this is just to point out some of the various aspects of unbundling, and unfortunately we are still at a limited sorry, just one second. We are still at a limited development of liberalization. As I've mentioned several times, 2020 should have been the moment in which the fourth package became effective, and now everything is somehow delayed until we come out of the emergency. But just to point out that although the system somehow tries to imitate what we've seen in air transport, railway transport has some differences which are quite significant and that make it more complex to realize liberalization as regards, instead, which we've seen has become very effective in the air transport sector. Are there any questions concerning today's lesson? Okay, then we'll reconvene tomorrow. We're going to finish the rail transport module tomorrow, and then we can go on for next week. We can go on and looking at the port services, and then pass on to protection of passengers, which is what affects us as travelers, as passengers. It is the most important part for us as users. So we'll reconvene tomorrow at 2:15 to finish the rail transport module.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.